So, welcome to my virtual layer. That's it. Now, a sort of odd little story for you. I actually run a futurist company that has been incorporated in space. That's it. So I typically tend to think that as a futures advisory, futures consultancy organization, we need to actually try to eat someone else's dog food and experiment with the future to see whether it's good, whether it's bad, or whatever it happens to be. So this is my space station. That's it for the day. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off here. So what we're going to do is we're going to futurize the document. Now, what I would actually encourage you to think about basically is we have to be very cautious basically with the language that we use, particularly when we're actually looking at innovation and future constructs. Because, for example, if I was talking here about futurizing documentation, then that would be different to futurizing the document. That's it. So when we're talking about innovation, when we're talking about future concepts, prototypes, applications, use cases, brainstorming, all these kinds of different things, language matters. That's it. So with no further ado, now as Adobe, as an organization, no doubt, let's see, the higher ups basically are looking at the document business and the PDF business, and they actually sort of see it growing really well. Now, on the one hand, this is because today we have about 3.5 billion to 4 billion people that are digitally connected to one another, but also to the systems around the world, which consequently means as more people embrace digital technologies and computers and computing and everything else, that inevitably means they are creating more content. Now, as they create more content, they're inevitably going to be creating more documents. So it's very easy basically for incumbent organizations like yourselves to actually look at the volume of documents and documentation that's being created and think everything is fine. It's kind of like that big shark analogy. Nothing is going to disrupt us. We are the incumbents. We're in prime position. What could possibly come along and eat our share? So this is where, ironically, I actually think we need to kind of turn the iceberg upside down, because when you have a look at how organizations' incumbents are disrupted, it's typically from below. It's typically basically from blind spots within the organization. And when we start having a look at how we start shredding the document, when we start killing the document, the future on that front has already started. So when we start having a look at documents themselves, if we produce documents in different ways, or if we even don't create documents, then that obviously affects basically the PDF business, as well as PDFs and so on and so forth. So this is what we're going to be focusing on in the first section of this particular presentation, is how we kill the document and how we have already killed the document, complete with examples. And then after that, we're going to have a look at what the future of documents, as well as user interfaces, could be, should be, might be, and so on and so forth. So, if we get down to basics, from an innovation perspective, we really have to understand why something exists in the first place. So, if you ask five whys, if you can answer comprehensively why something exists, and you still get to a good answer, then you're in a relatively solid position. So today, documents exist to convey and transfer information, enact or enforce different things. So we can think about this as contracts, but also enforcing other things such as rules, processes, organizational regulations, policies, those sorts of things. Documents are also there to instruct. So, for example, when we have a look at things like manuals, etc., etc., etc. But documents also act, particularly PDFs, also often act as a single version of the truth. Where, for example, if we have a look at statement of works, so on and so forth, those SOWs are often the single version of the truth. Contracts are often the single version of the truth. That is the thing that we refer to, the single document that we refer to when we want to understand what is it that we are supposed to be doing at an official level. So this is how the document died. Now, there are a number of different culprits, basically, when we actually talk about the, should we say, death of one thing or the change from one status quo to another. The first is that we have a culture shift. We've seen this, for example, if you have a look at e-commerce, we used to shop in physical stores, e-commerce came along, and then we had a culture shift, and culturally, a lot of people like shopping online. So culture shifts are often a culprit, basically, for something changing, transforming from one thing to another. Regulatory shifts. Now, for example, and there's multiple examples, the plastic bag around the world, the plastic bag industry around the world has been disrupted because governments regulated against it and said, if you want a plastic bag, you have to buy it. When we have a look at the car industry, by 2035, over half of the world's population will not be able to buy an actual car that has a combustion engine because of regulation. Not because the technology doesn't exist, not because culturally we don't want to buy internal combustion engine vehicles, but because of regulatory shifts. And in the UK, when we actually have a look at the position of the PDF from the UK government's perspective, the government has now dictated that all documentation on government portals has to be in an open document format, and they don't necessarily mean PDFs. And in fact, when you actually have a look at the UK government's websites, they actually say open document formats does not mean PDF. So regulatory shifts can actually change industries overnight, and we've seen lots of examples of that. There's also technology shifts, where we simply move from one type of technology, like the horse and cart, which is a technology, to a new kind of technology, the automotive car. So, and we have lots of different technology shifts. So from a computing perspective, we are at the very beginning of a technology shift that will move us from silicon-based computing to quantum-based computing. Artificial intelligences that run in the data center to artificial intelligences that run at the edge of the Internet of Things networks, and so on and so forth. And then the other reason, basically, why something often dies is because society was hit by a meteorite. That's it. Just ask the dinosaurs, basically, how they're getting along with their documentation programs. Not very well. Now, when we actually have a look at alternatives to an established incumbent's status quo or common product, the new products or the replacements generally always have to be more convenient. Now, for example, if you imagine the iPhone, if the iPhone was not more convenient than what went before, if it wasn't easy to use and accessible, if you had to program your iPhone every single time you used it, you wouldn't bother using it. So replacement products and services have to be more convenient, easy to use, invisible or transparent technology, seamless, that frictionless customer experience, but also from an enterprise perspective, frictionless use. It also has to be more effective. Now, when we say effective, this is quite a generic term, but if I want to accomplish a particular task or a particular goal or objective, then the new thing that I'm using has to help me be more effective at reaching that goal. So I have some examples of this. But it also has to be more efficient. Now, when we talk about efficient, again, quite a general term, we're talking about efficiency as it relates to commercials. So, for example, if my product is convenient and it's effective at helping you do something better and faster, but it's really expensive, then you're not going to use it. It's also got to be simple to use. I have to be able to pick it up. It needs to be intuitive, etc., etc., etc. So when we actually start looking at how different products and services are replaced and disrupted by new things that become the status quo, they have to be convenient, effective, and efficient. If you hit all those three, then you're generally in a good place, but then you also need to be able to execute that product into the market, and that is difficult. Now, when we have a look at, for example, convey and transfer, one of the sort of the raison d'etre basically for today's documents, there are a variety of ways that we've already killed the document and already killed different PDFs. So design proofs, entertainment, exercise theory, that's a weird one, but I'm putting that in there because my children do sports, so I'm going to explain that in a moment, and product design. So for example, when we have a look at design proofs, it used to be the case that if you wanted to design a product, you would send your imagery basically to a design house, whether it was for a mug, a t-shirt, whether it was for whatever. They would then start wrapping all of that up. They would then send you a document, typically a PDF, saying, is this actually what you want? Do you agree? You would sign something and then you'd send it back. Now, as we have a look at things like HTML5, for example, with organizations like Printify, all of the design is done on the website. The website acts as my system of record. I no longer have a PDF or a document provided to me by Printify to sign. This is my interface now. The document and the PDF in this particular example has gone. When we have a look at entertainment, we're increasingly moving basically, for example, from documentation. So, for example, we used to read real books. Then we would read PDFs. Basically, then we ended up with ebooks. But now we end up with audiobooks. So if you are a customer of Audible, when was the last time you download, you might download the PDF for the book that you are listening to, but when was the last time that you actually read that PDF of that book? You might dip into it occasionally, but frankly, if there was no PDF available for the book that you were listening to on Audible, would you care? When we have a look at exercise theory, it used to be the case for elite athletes that they would have to read up on huge amounts of different research to do basically with sports performance, nutrition, form, which is a form of exercise. So that's how you do the exercises, how you perform the sport and all that kind of stuff. But increasingly today, basically when we actually have a look at things like the haptic Tesla suit, which is not related to Elon Musk, as well as things like virtual reality, increasingly elite coaches are now starting to teach their elite athletes in virtual reality using haptic suits. So rather than me getting you to read a lot of documentation, if I want you to clench a bicep, for example, I can now read your muscle readings basically from the suit. So a Tesla suit is a kind of haptic suit, smart clothes, if you can put it like that. And I can copy you and mirror you and suggest the appropriate form to use. When we have a look at product design, if you step back sort of 10 to 20 years, a lot of the CAD files basically would increasingly sort of be zipped up, PDF'd, and so on and so forth. When we have a look at things like construction, the construction industry, it very much used to be the case that if you were actually designing a building, you would not only actually have reams of PDFs and documents and everything else, you would actually print all of that off, you would take it to site, and the project managers would be sitting there with all these documents on site, and they'd be writing different things on them. However, when we actually have a look at things like CAD design, basically BIM management systems and so on and so forth, increasingly there are no PDFs that are actually provided with these, because in some cases, while the design is actually done in full 3D digital reality, increasingly, basically when we start building buildings, we're starting to do that using augmented reality and immersive reality technologies that literally let us walk through the completed buildings before they're actually even built. When we have a look at enact or enforce, contracts, process control, and realty, similar story. So for example, increasingly we see technologies such as blockchain being used in conjunction with smart contracts to legally enforce something. So when I do something, the smart contract, which is a small piece of software that runs on a blockchain, says that I've done that thing, executes, and then the person who I'm working for automatically does something. So whether it's a payment, whether it's releasing products or goods or whatever it happens to be. So increasingly, when we actually have a look at contracts and contract law, Most organizations, for example, in the Fortune 250, are actually moving to some form of smart contract system, which is increasingly built into things like ERP platforms like SAP, Oracle, and so on and so forth. Now, when we have a look at process control, again, when we were writing down the processes of particular factories, we would document those processes, using documents. We would then PDF that up, and then we would actually send that through to the management teams and so on and so forth, basically for review. And then we would actually sign all of that off. But increasingly, when you have a look at things like robotic process automation technologies and software, all of this is just simply stored in the RPA tool sets. So there isn't any kind of document that you actually recognize any longer. In fact, even if you wanted to kick a document out of an RPA tool, it's increasingly difficult, which means that everything, all of the activities that we actually conduct are increasingly done in the enterprise software tool itself. When we have a look at realty, there's huge amounts of documents, especially if you're buying a house, for example. However, recently we've seen quite a number of different organizations turn houses into non-fungible tokens, which is a kind of digital asset. They have then incorporated those homes as their own LLC. So imagine your house being a registered LLC in the US. And then anytime basically that we actually want to buy the house, we want to maintain anything to do with the house and so on and so forth, everything is done via a Web3 technology on the blockchain. So again, this is very, very early stage, but in the realty industry, increasingly non-fungible tokens, smart contracts, Web3 and blockchain technologies are replacing what we would all regard as traditional documentation. I have sent you a PDF to sign, can you sign it? And this now indicates that you've bought the house, you've done some checks, whatever it happens to be. Now, when we have a look at the instruct component, basically, of documentation, whether it's education, maintenance, manuals and training, very similar story. In education, again, very early stage, basically, but when we have a look at things like EdTech, I myself run a virtual reality school. Now, what we've seen in virtual reality schools is that students, and we've had 700 students going through it so far, students retain 65% more information than in a traditional classroom setting. So while we haven't necessarily got rid of the traditional textbook, increasingly there's an easy way to see how technologies such as virtual reality and other leading edge technologies could replace textbooks, but actually completely reinvent learning. And actually, I was over in Las Vegas a little while ago, basically, and we were doing an innovation startup session, and we ended up awarding over $125,000 to charities based on organizations like Moorfield House University that have created virtual reality learning environments for their students that increasingly move away from kind of just traditional document-based learning. When we have a look at maintenance, organizations like Boeing, Mercedes, and so on and so forth, if you wanted to learn how to fix an aircraft engine with the likes of General Electric, then you would have huge amounts of manuals. Those manuals would be PDF'd. Now, increasingly, these organizations are simply using augmented reality combined with teleoperations and telepresence, where I can be standing in front of a jet engine like this one, and as a smart jet engine, it will tell me what's wrong with it. I will then have an augmented reality manual that then tells me exactly what to do. But this AR manual isn't a traditional document in any sense of the word. This is where I reach out and the system highlights the part that I need to pull out. It then, using augmented reality, then has a bunch of text saying, this is what you need to do. Take part A out, replace it with part B, connect cable C to cable D, and so on and so forth. And as a technician, if I'm having trouble, then I can actually use these augmented reality headsets to dial in an operator, another maintenance engineer that could be anywhere on the planet, and they can look like they're standing next to me, and they can be pointing to these digital twin jet engines and saying, well, you didn't connect cable D to cable C properly, so you need to take that back out. So this is where we combine augmented reality and immersive reality technologies with telepresence, 5G, and all kinds of other things to essentially eliminate the manual. When we have a look at Mercedes, increasingly Mercedes will let you just use your smartphone, and then you tell the smartphone what you want to do. You might want to replace you might want to replace spark plugs or whatever it happens to be. And on your phone, you hover over the engine. The smartphone will identify the different parts of the engine, highlight the spark plugs, tell you exactly what you need to do, take that out, put a new one in, done. So again, we're sort of starting to get rid of the document. Now, this is sort of quite a funny one. When we actually have a look at manuals, I'm a massive Adobe user. I've been using Adobe really since the 1990s. Now, this is kind of a document basically from whatever it is. I think it's Adobe Photoshop version 2. Which would have been kind of the 1990s, that sort of thing. Now, if you think about enterprise software, we always used to ship enterprise software with all this documentation. This documentation was then digitized and put into a PDF. Now, when I actually buy even products from Adobe, I don't get any PDFs. Basically, I download Adobe Creative Suite onto my laptop. And in terms of instructional manuals, I never go anywhere near a PDF because it's all HTML5. That's it. So if I want to learn how to use Photoshop, for example, as many of you sort of probably use some of these products, it simply walks me through using a video, or it walks me through on the website. Again, different kind of documentation, but the documentation is not a traditional document. It isn't a traditional PDF any longer. And you can buy those documents or you can buy those manuals from Etsy for £85 if you want to buy one. Now, when we have a look at training as well, in the medical field, because this isn't just where we're sort of talking about some interesting edge use cases where the barrier to entry is really low. When we start having a look at how surgeons increasingly are being trained, surgeons are also increasingly being trained using virtual reality and augmented reality tools. And in some cases, their productivity is increased by 200%. But in terms of the outcome that we want as a surgeon, these technologies are helping surgeons learn faster and get to the real job faster. So the efficiency for the hospital basically is increasing. So again, a different kind of training, but nevertheless, this is literally life and death stuff. Now, so that's some of the ways basically that we are killing the document, altering the document, doing new things in new ways. It's not always about just killing stuff and moving to a new thing. But when we start talking about futurizing the document, firstly, there are 3 different kinds of state for documents today. So we have physical documents, we have digital documents, and then we have virtual documents. Now, virtual documents are not digital documents. They are fundamentally different constructs. But this is kind of the interface that I'm actually using. Now, when we actually start talking about the future use cases and applications, basically, of some of these different things, we can't really help but talk about gadgets. So today, if you want to read a PDF, basically in the metaverse, then you need a bulky Oculus Quest headset and you need controllers. But these are glasses from HTC. Increasingly, we get rid of the controllers because we can do things with our hands, and the camera's basically in these particular glasses. So if you want to get into a virtual reality office, pretty much now, but certainly in the near future, you just put these glasses on, you're in. You take them off, you're out. So again, when we start having a look at the acceleration of some of these different states of matter, as I call them, increasingly virtual basically will actually start taking off more. But when we have a look at other kinds of computing, this is a smart contact lens basically from Mojo Vision in the United States. It is literally an augmented reality smart contact lens that has been FDA approved, that works, that, bless you, that puts computing literally in your face. So when we start thinking about Minority Report, for example, with Tom Cruise and everything else, that's it. He'd either have holograms, and we'll discuss those later, or he'd actually have some kind of technology like this. But this technology is now here. We've been talking about these for decades. Now, the codexes that I've written, that some of you that you've got access to, just for a laugh, I decided to write the Trends Codex in virtual reality. So actually using all of my Adobe tools and things. So this was actually written in InDesign and then converted to a PDF in virtual reality. And actually it was quite an odd experience. But even though as Adobe you are now already putting PDFs basically into the metaverse, how far ahead are you actually thinking? Are you staying in your comfort zone, or actually are you starting to think, how would people interact with virtual documents in the future? Because if you want to boost people's productivity by over 30%, as Stanford University did a little while ago, if I'm in the metaverse and I am creating a document, then I might be typing using two hands. But when we actually have a look at the metaverse, when we have a look at virtual reality, there are no rules. Rules of nature don't apply. So what Stanford did is they created a third hand for people. So if I'm creating documents in the metaverse, I can use two hands, but also a third hand that's coming out of my virtual avatar's chest. And that increased productivity by 30%. So this is sort of where, when we start having a look at things like virtual constructs, there are some very weird left of field thinking, basically, that we can actually start including in what would a future user interface look like, basically, in that particular world. Now, from an architectural perspective, increasingly this is where we need to look at things like future of computing, but also Web3. So from an architectural perspective, how are documents stored, how are they created, the programming languages that we actually use. We already have synthetic biology programming languages coming through. We are also on the 6th generation of biological computer, where we have stored documents as well as YouTube videos within bacteria and in DNA. Microsoft has been working with an organization called Twist Bioscience to create DNA-based storage platforms, which means that you can store over half an exabyte's worth of information in 1 gram's worth of synthetic DNA. We have chemical programming coming through, quantum programming coming through. So when we talk about the architectural layer, the programming languages and so on and so forth, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, there's a lot more sci-fi-like change than you might think. And then, of course, when we have a look at the document itself, increasingly it is enabled and augmented by technology. So these technologies are invariably artificial intelligence based, MXR. So note the X. I'm not talking about AR. So I'm not just talking about augmented reality, mixed reality, or virtual reality. I'm talking about something called MXR. And we will come on to that in a little bit, because you may or may not have heard of it. And then we have Web3 and next generation user interfaces. So when we start having a look at, when we start taking a sort of more linear look, for example, my codex is a 400-page PDF. If I ask you if you've read it, read all of it, you won't have, because how many people read a 400-page PDF? But by starting to incorporate conversational and behavioral user interfaces, you can talk to that PDF. You can get the artificial intelligence basically to summarize the PDF. So for example, why aren't you able to talk to my codex and say, I would like you to summarize all of the latest artificial intelligence developments? And the system comes back and says, well, here's the top 3 things you need to know. We have data mining, of course, basically, which is when we have a look at the legal space. Basically, that's a big USP, and so on and so forth. But from a user interface perspective, I still read documents and PDFs. I still interact with them in a very traditional way. But this is where, when you have a look at behavioral computing, we are moving to more natural language-based interfaces. From a linked perspective, now if you're at home basically and you are actually reading a PDF, reading a recipe basically in a PDF format, then increasingly basically you might want to link to other diverse sources. That's it. Now we can do this with standard URL embeds. We can start doing this with dynamic content embeds and everything else. But increasingly, why isn't that document basically able to link to absolutely anything and everything? And basically with one step, it takes you basically to, for example, a supplier. So if I need to buy cinnamon for my cake, why doesn't it actually link basically to suppliers basically that provide organic cinnamon or whatever it happens to be? So this is where everything increasingly should be linked, accessible, and just one hop away. But when we have a look at generative PDFs and generative documents, these don't exist yet. But this is what I regard as information your way. But this is a completely new form of information extraction and conversion based on something called artificial intelligence transformers. So for example, if you have a manual or if you have a lecture, and organizations like Udacity basically are kind of doing some of these things. If I have a lecture document that I have to read as a student, traditionally, I would read that document, right? However, we all learn in different ways. We all ingest information in different ways. I'm actually more of a visual learner, basically, than a reader. So using artificial intelligence transformers, which is a synthetic content play, why couldn't I use a conversational interface to talk to the document, talk to the PDF, and have a system that converts the text or imagery basically that is in that document into what we call synthetic content or generative content. So for example, if you were reading a traditional, let's say a book, and you read this passage, a couple walked down the street in the pouring rain. Today's documents are just static. You read it, you move on to the next sentence. But if I start embedding generative artificial intelligence abilities into these documents, then the AIs can convert that text using what we call a transformer into that video that you see on the right-hand side. So now I can start visualizing the information within those documents in my way, not your way, in my way. Moving on, I can start turning these static, flat 2D documents basically into immersive documents. So for example, if it's an aircraft manual, if it's a recipe, I could say to the artificial intelligence, can you turn this recipe into a video for me? Increasingly, we can do that. But furthermore, I could even say, can you turn it into an augmented reality, mixed reality, or even virtual reality construct? So if I wanted to actually try to learn how to bake the cake in a virtual reality world, increasingly with organizations like NVIDIA, I can simply say, convert this recipe into a virtual reality-based video that I'm able to interact with that then shows me and teaches me how to make this cake. So when we start having a look at the field of synthetic media and synthetic content, which is what I tend to do with Disney, the Hollywood studios, as well as other organizations around the world, this is where today the creative industry represents $6 trillion worth of global GDP and employs 235 million people. But generative artificial intelligence is now starting to democratize content creation. Now I can also do this. So I've turned whatever it is, I've turned a recipe into a virtual reality construct, or just a plain old video, or a set of images, or into audio, etc., etc., etc. But now I can say to that document, add sound, if it's based on the couple walking down the street in the pouring rain, add sound to the video and push it into virtual reality. So again, we're at the very start of this particular kind of journey, but this technology already exists. So what would happen if we could take a standard document, 2D text, and turn it into something much more dynamic, procedural content? In addition to that, if I am starting to bring this document to life, why can't I now start creating different products and objects and everything else that I can feel, that I can smell and taste? So when we actually have a look at the development of virtual reality gadgets and gizmos and everything else, We have Disney that have been creating haptic clothing, Tesla, which is not the car company Tesla, that is creating what we call haptic clothing, but which means that if you're wearing a haptic glove and I high five you, you can feel that, even though you might be 3,500 miles away. In Japan, we actually have a variety of different universities that are creating gadgets that let you smell things in virtual reality, taste things in virtual reality. So if I use that cake example, I could say to the document, push this into a virtual reality movie, and then you could actually even smell the cake, you could taste the cake before it's even made. So this is where we really start talking about bringing documents to life. Now, when we have a look at things like holographic technology and holographic constructs, organizations like Samsung see holography as being a major use case for 6G. So 6G is what comes after 5G, circa 2028. And they're already developing both holographic and 6G technologies. So MXR is where the X is sensory. So today, basically, when we have a look at things like virtual reality and augmented reality, inevitably, basically, they apply to sight and sound, maybe touch, but MXR actually applies to all 5 senses. We have centaurs. So when we talk about the future of work, for example, when I'm creating my documents, I'm sitting down. So for example, take the codexes that I created. That is me sitting at a standard computer with a keyboard and mouse using InDesign basically to create the codexes basically that you see. However, when we start bringing artificial intelligence into the mix, we have something called the centaur principle. So the centaur principle is a future of work construct that means that we can combine the best of human skills with the best of technology-based skills, traditionally artificial intelligence. So for example, when it starts coming to document creation, in my codex, I might start writing about the future of artificial intelligence, but using digital humans, using conversational artificial intelligence, a little bit like the ones that we actually see in today's smart speakers, which will remain nameless. This is why increasingly there is no reason basically why I can't say, okay, I need some help writing this chapter on the future of artificial intelligence. And the AIs will say, well, actually, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? By the way, I've just written a paragraph for you. Would you now like to continue? So this again ties into the generative content basically that we're actually seeing. So when we have a look at the centaur principle, increasingly, when we start augmenting human skills basically with technology, you end up with some really interesting facets. So for example, when we have a look at Google, are you better off or worse off for having Google? Because arguably the only thing that Google does is put all of the world's information at your fingertips. But when we start having a look at the next step of artificial intelligence, particularly as it relates to things like the internet and work, conversational artificial intelligence will increasingly allow me to co-create documents and things with AI. And that opens up a whole new raft of different use cases, even to the point where increasingly I can talk to an artificial intelligence and say, AI, can you create a software program for me? And it goes off and creates it. Can you create a new piece of furniture for me or clothing with companies like Under Armour and Amazon? And the system creates it. So what happens basically when we start collaborating much more with artificial intelligence? When we have a look at things like modularity, increasingly basically we have information all over the world and everything else. The vast majority of documents basically need to reference a whole variety of different things around the planet. So increasingly, why don't we kind of have a library of libraries, a GitHub kind of repository for information, where if I need information, I just bring it into the document. Now, if that document changes, it can automatically update the document as well. Most documents are generally static. Once I've written it and saved it, that's it. It's in that form until I change it. So why aren't documents much more dynamic? This is where we can look at things like content locks. So for example, if I've written a piece on the future of artificial intelligence and there's new research, the system automatically updates my document for me. But if I don't want that, I can just lock the content down so that I have a final form document. Library linking, Web 3.0 keeps cropping up when we talk about the future of document creation and so on and so forth. But starting to move beyond that, when we have a look at things like brain-machine interface technologies, basically we have organizations like Facebook, as well as the US military, as well as Carnegie Mellon University and more, and a lot more, that are already creating brain-machine interfaces that can literally read your mind. Now, these things basically can read your mind, they can read sentences, but they can also do a lot more, and I'll show you that in the next section. So increasingly, when we talk about things like the future of document interfaces as it relates to neural interfaces, I don't need a keyboard, I don't need a mouse, I just think. So I think about what I want to create, what I want to put down into that document. And the document basically will then start coming alive. Now, if I combine that with things like the Centaur principle, for example, the artificial intelligence can automatically read my mind and say, well, I know that you wanted to create a chapter on the future of artificial intelligence, but I think that you've missed this information, and this information. So I've augmented that information for you automatically. Would you like to approve those changes? And I just go, yes, no. So when we have a look at neural interfaces, we are much further along when it comes to neural interfaces than you might think. But these are unidirectional brain-machine interfaces. Companies like Huawei are increasingly talking about putting BMIs into your smartphone. So when you're talking about sort of WeChat or WhatsApp or whatever it happens to be, you just think the message and it sends automatically, which is a bit scary. But when we sort of start moving beyond that, we've already actually seen the development of bidirectional brain-machine interfaces that on the one hand can actually read your thoughts, but can also start putting stuff into your head as well. Now, this takes us into a very strange area. The regulators are already having kittens about this, particularly as it relates to privacy and neural hacking and so on and so forth. But when we start talking about documents, again, who's creating the document? So at the moment, basically, I as a human might create the document. I might create the document with another person. I might create the document basically with an artificial intelligence or a machine. But also machines are increasingly creating not necessarily documents, but records of stuff. So this is increasingly where we start getting into conversations basically about bidirectional neural interfaces. And when we start having a look at this, would you use a document in its current format today? And so bearing in mind basically that the brain works in a very, very strange and very plastic way. So this is a telepathic robot. So in this particular environment, the person with the brain cap is thinking, and the robot is then doing whatever they actually tell it to do. Now, we also have robots that are communicating with one another. So while you might look at that particular robot, and think, well, it looks a bit comical and so on and so forth, that is technology that is way beyond the bleeding edge. What the person was doing there is they were using brain communication to control the robot, but we can go one further today. We can use brain communication to train the robot to do new things without it ever having to do it. So the way we program robots is changing. Now, when we have a look at Google, Google now has robots basically that automatically generate hive minds. So you teach one robot one thing and it automatically teaches every other robot that it's connected to on the planet that thing. So when we start having a look at telepathically training robots or robots that actually teach one another different skills, how do you document that? So that's the end of the first bit. And then next, we're going on to how science fiction is dead.